It was the middle of winter. A lonely mountain road covered in snow, silent under the weight of February. On the shoulder of Route 112 in New Hampshire, a black Saturn sat facing the wrong way. Its front end dented, both airbags deployed. Hazard, lights blinking through the cold night. Inside the car, officers would later find wine, a box of belongings, and a rag stuffed strangely into the exhaust pipe. But the driver, 21-year-old Maura Murray, was gone. She had vanished in a 10-minute window between when neighbors saw her pacing outside the vehicle and when police arrived. Nearly 20 years later, the question still haunts her family, investigators, and thousands of true crime followers around the world. Did Maura run away into the mountains? Was she picked up by a stranger? Or did the woods of New Hampshire hide something no one has yet uncovered? Because on that night in 2004, one thing was certain. The car was found. Maura was not. To understand the vanishing of Maura Murray, you first have to understand who she was. Maura wasn't a drifter. She wasn't someone who left without warning. She grew up in Hanson, Massachusetts, one of 5 children in a close-knit Irish-American family. People described her as smart, determined, and competitive, a runner who could push through miles of pain, and a student who had earned her way into West Point Military Academy before deciding nursing was her true path. By early 2004, Maura was in her junior year at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. On the surface, she was a typical college student balancing classes, clinical rotations, and a relationship with her longtime boyfriend Billy, who was stationed with the Army in Oklahoma. But just beneath the surface, things were not so steady. Friends would later recall that she seemed restless, stressed, and weighed down by something she didn't share. There had been small but telling cracks. She'd recently been caught using a stolen credit card number to order food. She had crashed her father's brand new car after a night of drinking, just days before her disappearance. And then there was the phone call, one that came late during a campus security shift. A call that made her break down in tears, so violently that her supervisor had to walk her back to her dorm. To this day, no one knows what was said on that call, or who was on the other end. Still, no one thought she would just disappear. But on February 9, 2004, Maura told her professors she had a family emergency and wouldn't be in class. That wasn't true. There was no family emergency. Instead, she packed up her dorm room into boxes, withdrew nearly $300 in cash from an ATM, bought alcohol at a local liquor store, and printed MapQuest directions to the White Mountains of New Hampshire. She didn't tell her roommate. She didn't tell her father. She didn't tell Billy. By 4:30 p.m. that day, Maura was driving north out of Amherst in her black Saturn sedan, headed straight into one of the strangest mysteries America has ever seen. By 7:30 p.m., her car would be found wrecked and abandoned on Route 112. But by the time police arrived, Maura was gone. By the time Maura reached the small town of Haverhill, New Hampshire, the sun had long disappeared behind the mountains. It was 7:25 p.m. when residents along Route 112 began noticing something unusual outside their windows. A black Saturn sat awkwardly against a snowbank. Headlights dim, hazard lights blinking in steady rhythm. The road was quiet with only the occasional car passing through. It wasn't the kind of place where college students from Massachusetts were expected to be, especially not in the dead of winter. One neighbor, Faith Westman, peered out her kitchen window. She thought she saw a young woman moving around the vehicle, but the distance and the dim light made it difficult to be sure. Faith called 911 to report what looked like a single-car accident. Another neighbor, Butch Atwood, a local school bus driver, pulled his yellow bus alongside the stranded Saturn. Inside, he saw a young woman, slender, dark-haired, bundled against the cold. She looked shaken but not visibly injured. Atwood offered help. He asked if she wanted him to call the police or get a tow. Maura shook her head firmly, insisting. She had already contacted AA roadside service. That was a lie. Records later showed no such call was ever made. Butch found her calm yet oddly dismissive, as if she wanted him gone quickly. Uneasy, he drove off, but later said he checked his rearview mirror and saw her pacing back and forth around the car. When officers arrived at 7:46 p.m., barely 10 minutes after Faith's call, Maura was gone. The Saturn told a confusing story. Both airbags had deployed. Wine was splattered inside, and an empty box of Francia sat in the back. Her belongings, including school books and printed directions, were neatly packed. And strangest of all, a rag was stuffed into the tailpipe, a crude attempt either to fix a problem or to sabotage the car entirely. The car was locked. The engine was still warm. The hazards clicked against the darkness. But there was no sign of Maura. A police dog brought to the scene tracked her scent east along the road for about 100 yards, before it stopped cold in the middle of the pavement. It was as if she had stepped into another vehicle. No footprints led into the woods. No trail led further down the road. It was as if the snow itself had swallowed her whole. The search for Maura began within hours, but the way authorities handled those first 48 hours would leave more questions than answers, and decades of doubt. At first, police didn't treat the scene like the start of a major disappearance. To them, it was a routine single-car accident. A young woman, maybe a little drunk, embarrassed, who'd walked away to spend the night with a friend. They expected she would resurface in the morning, hungover but safe. But the hours ticked by, and Maura never returned. The following day, February 10th, her father, Fred Murray, drove to Haverhill. He had spoken with Maura only days earlier, when she'd borrowed his car. That crash had been a small disaster, the brand new vehicle wrecked against a guardrail. But nothing about it made Fred believe she was unstable or suicidal. Now he was standing on the snowy roadside, staring at her Saturn. The airbags hung limp, the windows frosted. The rag stuffed into the tailpipe looked even stranger up close, like a desperate patch job or an ominous signal. Fred's chest tightened. Something was wrong. Police finally began organizing a larger search. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, and volunteers to comb the woods around Route 112. The dogs caught her scent leading east along the road for roughly 100 yards, and then abruptly, the trail ended in the middle of the asphalt. No footprints veered into the snow. No scent carried into the trees. The implication was chilling. Maura had either been picked up by another vehicle or she had vanished in a way no one could explain. Helicopters flew low, using infrared to detect any sign of body heat. Volunteers trudged shoulder to shoulder through the forest, scanning every hollow and snowbank. Residents opened barns, sheds, and cellars. The cold cut deep into everyone's lungs, but the only thing found was silence. By the second night, Fred Murray was pacing outside the motel where search teams had set up headquarters. He grew frustrated with the pace of the investigation. Why weren't they treating this as foul play? Why weren't they canvassing every driver who passed through Route 112? Meanwhile, Maura's boyfriend Billy was notified. Stationed at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, he received the call that his girlfriend had disappeared in New Hampshire. He immediately flew east, frantic, leaving his post behind. The family gathered, their faces raw with shock. Each of them replayed their last conversations, with Maura looking for signs they had missed. A sister remembered her sounding distracted. A friend recalled she seemed weighed down by something she didn't explain. But none of them imagined she would just walk off into the freezing woods. And yet, that was the explanation investigators leaned toward: an alcohol-fueled walkaway. A young woman embarrassed by a car crash avoiding the police. It was the simplest answer, and therefore the one they assumed. But for Fred Murray, that was impossible. He stood by the Saturn, snowflakes gathering on his coat, and whispered the only thought he couldn't shake. She was taken. In the days ahead, small details would surface: a mysterious call, a rag in the tailpipe, and rumors of a second car near the scene. Each clue only deepened the mystery. As the hours turned into days, the investigation began to circle around the strangest part of this case: the details left behind in and around the Saturn. When officers first inventoried the car, they found several unusual items. On the back seat sat a box of Franzia wine, broken open with red stains splattered inside the vehicle. A soda bottle smelled strongly of alcohol, as if wine had been poured into it for the trip. Scattered nearby were empty beer bottles. It painted a troubling picture. A young woman driving alone on icy mountain roads, possibly under the influence. But then there was the rag in the tailpipe. It was stuffed tightly inside, wedged against the metal. Mechanics later debated its meaning. Was it an improvised attempt by Maura to prevent the car from smoking? The Saturn was old, prone to leaking oil and overheating. Fred Murray admitted he had once told Maura to keep a rag in the trunk, just in case. But police couldn't shake another thought. Could it have been sabotage? Could someone else have tampered with her car that night? Another curious discovery. Inside the Saturn, Maura had carefully packed items for a trip: clothing, textbooks, directions printed from MapQuest toward Bartlett, New Hampshire. Her dorm room, however, was boxed up as if she was leaving campus for good. To her family, that suggested planning. To police, it looked like a college student overwhelmed and running from her life. Witness statements added new layers. Faith Westman swore she saw a man smoking a cigarette in the Saturn that night, something investigators later dismissed as a trick of the shadows. Butch Atwood's memory of Maura refusing his help and insisting she'd already called AAA clashed with phone records that proved no such call ever happened. And then there was the timeline. Police logs showed the 911 call at 7:27 p.m. Officers arrived at 7:46. In less than 20 minutes, Maura had vanished. If she had wandered off into the woods, how had she left no footprints? If she had been picked up by another driver, why had no one come forward in all these years? Her phone records added another layer of confusion. Just before leaving Amherst, Maura had called a friend to check on a party, and she'd also contacted a number connected to accommodations in the White Mountains. Why? Was she planning a vacation, a secret rendezvous, or an escape? Even her internet search history offered conflicting signals. Alongside MapQuest directions, she had looked up properties in Vermont, and bizarrely, even articles about how to survive cold weather in the wilderness. Theories began to sprout like weeds. Some said she had planned her disappearance, a voluntary, vanishing act. Others said she was running from some darker truth. Still others believed foul play was involved, and that whoever picked her up that night never let her go. For Fred Murray, these details were unbearable. He stood in front of the cameras holding his daughter's photograph and insisted, "Maura didn't run away. Someone out there took her." The car had become a tomb of contradictions, organized, yet chaotic, packed with plans, yet abandoned. Familiar items, but also clues that didn't make sense. And then came the whispers from locals, that a second car had been seen near the Saturn that night, idling in the darkness. If that was true, then someone else knew exactly what happened. To Maura Murray. The talk of a second car unsettled the investigation from the start. Some locals swore they had seen another vehicle parked nose to nose with Maura's Saturn, hazard lights flashing in unison. Others whispered of a truck idling on the road just minutes before police arrived. None of these accounts were consistent enough to make it into official reports. But they were consistent enough to ignite theories that would never die. Fred Murray clung to the idea that his daughter had been picked up, either by someone she knew or by a stranger whose intentions were anything but good. He pressed the police relentlessly. "Check the houses along Route 112. Someone here knows what happened." But law enforcement treated the case differently. To them, Maura was a troubled young woman under stress, who had likely wandered into the woods after drinking. It was an accident, not a crime. Their hesitance in the first 48 hours, their refusal to lock down the crash scene as a crime scene, left Fred and others convinced that crucial evidence had been lost forever. The divide between police and family widened. The family begged for search warrants. Police insisted there was no probable cause. Meanwhile, the woods closed in around the unanswered questions. And then came the cadaver dogs, and what they signaled, just a few hundred yards from the Saturn. Cadaver dogs were brought in within days of Maura's disappearance. The animals were trained to detect the faintest trace of human remains, even weeks or months old. One team led their dog to a house less than half a mile from where Maura's car was found. Almost immediately, the dog alerted. Handlers marked the spot. The scent was strongest in the living room near the floorboards. For Fred Murray, this was the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. He demanded police obtain a search warrant. Investigators, however, were reluctant. They eventually entered the home, but not until years later. And by then, whatever evidence might have been there was long gone. When nothing was found, officials declared it a dead lead. But the damage was done. For many, the idea that Maura's scent, her presence, had been picked up in a nearby house was proof that foul play had always been part of this story. And while this was happening, reporters uncovered another chilling piece of information. Maura had lied to nearly everyone about why she was going north. In the days before she vanished, Maura had been weaving a story. She told professors she had a family emergency. She told her boyfriend she'd talk soon. She told no one about her real plan. Police traced her final computer searches. She had looked up directions to rental condos near ski resorts in Vermont. She'd researched places to stay in New Hampshire. And strangely, she had read about accidents in the White Mountains, including one case where a woman had frozen to death after being stranded in the wilderness. Why was she looking up these things? Was she preparing for something? Some theorists believe Maura intended to disappear voluntarily. Maybe she wanted to start a new life in Canada, just hours north. Maybe she was running from a relationship that wasn't working. But others see her lies as evidence of something darker, that she was meeting someone in secret, and that person knows exactly why her Saturn ended up wrecked against the snow. Whatever. The truth, the next confirmed piece of evidence would be just as baffling. Her dorm room packed away like she'd planned never to come back. When investigators searched Maura's dorm, they found her room stripped of personality. Boxes were packed neatly, surfaces cleared, almost as if she was moving out. Her school books were in the Saturn. Clothes were folded and put away. It didn't look like someone planning a weekend getaway. It looked like someone closing a chapter. This discovery fueled the voluntary disappearance theory. Maybe Maura wasn't abducted. Maybe she left on purpose. But her family rejected the idea outright. Maura was close to her father. She adored her siblings. She would never have walked away without a word, and she certainly wouldn't have abandoned her beloved stuffed animal, Huggins, which still sat inside the Saturn. Fred Murray went on camera again and again. "My daughter didn't run away. Somebody took her." And then, weeks later, new witnesses came forward, claiming they had seen a young woman matching Maura's description running through the woods the very night she vanished. Tips poured in. A couple driving home claimed they saw a figure running down Route 112, dark hair loose, jacket flapping in the cold. Another person reported a distressed young woman huddled in the shadows of a barn. Each lead brought search teams, rushing, and each one evaporated into nothing. The sheer number of conflicting sightings muddied the waters. Which ones were real? Which ones were the result of panic and gossip? The rumor mill grew vicious. Some locals accused Fred Murray of knowing more than he admitted. Others whispered about Maura's boyfriend, Billy, who some said had a volatile temper. Online forums lit up with speculation, and the case became one of the first internet-driven true crime phenomena. And then, as the months passed, the searches dwindled. Route 112 grew quiet again, and Maura's trail, if it ever existed, went cold. As 2004 gave way to 2005 and then to years beyond, the case of Maura Murray shifted from an active search to a haunting legend. Her father kept returning to New Hampshire, handing out flyers, pleading for tips. Journalists revisited the story every anniversary. Online sleuths dissected every scrap of evidence, the rag, the wine, the dorm room boxes. But officially, nothing moved. No body was found. No confirmed suspect identified. Just theories. Some believed she had succumbed to the cold and her body had simply never been discovered. Others clung to the idea of a predator on Route 112, someone who stopped for a stranded young woman and made sure she never got home. And then came whispers of Maura in Canada, sightings at bus stations, a woman who looked like her working at a motel. Each one investigated, each one debunked. Still, the case refused to die. It had just enough clues to stay alive, and just enough silence to remain unsolved. And then, years later, cadaver dogs would once again lead investigators back to that same house near the crash site. More than a decade after Maura vanished, pressure mounted on police to re-examine old leads. Cadaver dogs were reintroduced to the house near Route 112. Once again, they signaled strongly. Once again, investigators dug, and once again, nothing. But the family couldn't accept that. Fred Murray insisted there had been enough time to clean or move evidence. To him, the dog's repeated alerts were all the proof he needed that Maura had met with foul play close to where her Saturn was found. Police, however, maintained their position. There was no evidence of a crime, and no reason to declare the house connected. The standoff between family and investigators only deepened the pain and the mystery. To this day, the case rests on a handful of theories. Voluntary disappearance. That Maura staged her getaway, tired of school and relationships, and vanished into a new life. Accident. That she wandered into the woods drunk and disoriented and her body remains hidden by nature. Foul play. That she was picked up, possibly by someone she knew, possibly by a stranger, and that her disappearance was no accident. Each theory explains something. None explain everything. Why the dorm room packed? Why the rag in the tailpipe? Why the scent trail ending in the middle of the road? The questions only multiplied with time. The disappearance of Maura Murray became one of the internet's first true crime obsessions. Forums dissected maps, photographs, even satellite imagery. Podcasts dedicated entire seasons to the case. A television documentary reignited debates. For her family, this meant never escaping the story. Every year they faced cameras and strangers who claimed to know the truth. Every year, they lived the same nightmare without answers. Fred Murray grew older, still demanding justice, still walking Route 112 with flyers. His grief became the face of the case. A father who would never stop searching. It's been nearly 2 decades since that night in 2004. The Saturn still sits in police photographs, hazard lights flashing in the snow, airbags limp, a rag stuffed in the exhaust. But the driver, Maura Murray, has never been found. On Route 112, neighbors still remember the sound of that crash. Searchers still remember the bitter cold, the dogs, the empty woods, and her family still remembers the phone calls that never came, the voice they never heard again. What happened to Maura remains an open wound, one of the most enduring mysteries in America, because on that night, the car was found, Maura was not. If stories of vanished lives and unsolved mysteries keep you watching, make sure to subscribe. That way, you won't miss the next story, one that might be even more chilling.